Investing Insights with Right Property Group, exploring trends in real estate and helping property investors gain financial security.
Hello everybody, welcome to another filmed version of Investing Insights with Right Property Group, and as always it is Steve Waters and Victor Kumar. And Vic, I know we keep saying it, but a lot has happened since the last podcast.
Yep.
But the big news, I guess, is the rates went up again.
Yet again.
Contrary to what everyone thought around there being a continued pause.
Yeah.
In fact, we came out, the pause beforehand, it was kind of the pause they shouldn't have had, was our thought process around it, and perhaps it should have been this time.
Yep.
Nonetheless, it's above our pay grade, and they put the rates up again another 25 basis points. So
It doesn't seem to have stalled the market that much.
well, I was about to say that. Like, was there an effect there where they were potentially hoping to slow the narrative in and around real estate and how it's bottomed out and it's continued to grow and et cetera, et cetera. But it hasn't.
No.
Auction clearance rates on the weekend, as of the time of this recording,
Record level.
record levels, which is really interesting. Like, regardless, I believe, of being on pause or not, you can understand how people would say, well, it just doesn't make sense that we're seeing these record clearance rates, really, seasonally adjusted, of course. But when you just sort of sit back, pause, and understand all the mechanisms and the things that are happening in behind the scenes, well, then you can it makes sense that they're very buoyant clearing rates.
Yeah, and people have adjusted very quickly to the new norm, right? So first of all, we are crying poor because we had such a rapid rise from a very low bottom to begin with. And now that we are in the fives with most banks, people have really quickly adjusted and realized that, hang on, a couple of years back, that's what they were.
Well, they were. It wasn't too long ago, right?
Yeah.
Well, it seems like a long time ago, but realistically it wasn't. But I think, on that point, when the reason that the RBA has put the rates up is obviously inflation is still very sticky and stubborn, and they really need to squash it. We all know that. The cost of living is clearly escalated. People's ability to not to survive but thrive has definitely been eroded. And you and I are having a conversation earlier on this morning about how you've seen some of the retail shops in the big shopping centres with the roller doors down and the big sort of laminated sign saying essentially repossessed by landlord.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there are people that are struggling because the cost of acquisition is very high. Yeah, and we've just obviously handed down a budget where we're in the first surplus budget in 15 years. And the reality of it is just to quash the inflation, and we'll be back into deficit the following budget.
Yeah, and it's a bit of smoke and mirrors in
false positive.
In around those budgetary numbers. But we'll go into that into the budget as the dust settles, perhaps next episode or something like that.
Because that way we are away from the noise and we can actually look at the nitty gritty of it as well, right? So a lot of people make predictions on the budget immediately as it comes out, and the little bits and pieces that leak ahead of the budget night. But the reality and the detail comes in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, after the budget has actually been announced.
The one thing we can say, though, is that they have, through different, potential policies, because it's still got to get across the Senate, but they've identified and they've recognised, more importantly, that there is a housing crisis.
Huge crisis.
Some would say the worst we've ever seen. And we've been talking about this now for a long time.
Before COVID.
Well before COVID. That's right. We said, look, this is what will happen. Us and others, perhaps that have been through this before and seen the different cycles. But nonetheless, here we are, and the government have identified, or they've recognised, this is a pretty crappy situation that we're in.
It's real.
And it's real. That's actually a very good point, because up until recently, I don't believe that a big section of the media, government, and the like, they all talked about this housing crisis, but I thought they thought that it was still a potential, and it was theoretical. But now they're saying, look, this is real, this is bad, and of course, so the policy that they're presenting or putting forward is to help tackle that. But we'll go into it. But one thing I don't think that we can deny is that Australia is in the midst of the Great Reset.
Mm-hmm.
It will be one of the biggest resets we've seen. It'll be the biggest reset in our life.
Yeah, absolutely it will.
And I believe that the reset started with COVID. And we'll dig into that a little bit later. But I think also, as big as there's the Great Australian Reset, in a very short period of time, there's going to be the Great Australian Regret.
Yep.
Without a shadow of a doubt. And you can see it percolating below the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll talk about that a little bit deeper. But before we do, let's give a quick market update. What are you seeing on the ground? Because it is a very dynamic market.
Yes.
And for the first time in a long time, all markets are independently performing differently from each other. So what are you saying?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And the reality of it is that we're finally settling back into normalcy in the sense that each market, as you said, operating differently because they all have different subsets of data, different stimulus, different characteristics, demographics. But the thing that's common across all markets at the moment is that there is an absolute shortage of stock. So what I mean by stock is properties on the market, particularly from an investment point of view. There is a huge shortage of good investment properties that actually makes sense buying in the Great Reset, right? And the reality of it is that combine that with the fact that the number of builders that are going bust is next level. Never seen these numbers before. That's also adding to the mix in terms of shortage of stock. And we all keep predicting that it'll turn around. But if we're not filling the pipeline, it'll take a long time to actually turn around.
It's a pretty easy equation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Supply and demand. Where's the supply? There is none. Holy hell.
Yep.
Yeah, and this is the predicament we're in. And it's interesting you talk about that pipeline, and we put something up on Facebook the other day in and around the construction numbers. Just to give it some context, we're at the lowest levels of construction since 2008.
Yeah, and that was the GFC.
The GFC, 2008. We all know what happened at the end of that, right? And I'm not saying that the lack of construction is the reason of, or the predicament, the reason for the predicament that we're in. That's not the case. There's a multitude of reasons why we are where we are, but it's such a big, I guess, spoke in the wheel or piece of the puzzle as to what we can expect in the future. And think about this, that 1 in 3 people rent their dwelling.
Yeah.
Right? So the roof over their head, they rent. And 90% of those rental accommodation is supplied by the retail investor, not the institutional investor, the retail investor.
Which they're trying to correct, but I think they're going around it the wrong way.
Do you know what? I was thinking about that the other day. It once again, not being a conspiracy theorist, but there are some that would say that the reason that the retail investor is being hamstrung is because the institutional investor recognises the potential and perhaps let's call it profit in the future. So they want a bigger piece of the pie, and it's being enabled by the different governments and their policy. Now, I don't buy into that. I just think big business is seeing an opportunity and the government is helping them, I guess, exploit that opportunity for want of a better word. But I also believe the government thinks that the archangel of solving this problem is big business, and it's not the case.
And it's true to form with any institution, right? They go for the bigger play as opposed to taking a grassroots approach where it'll be more sustained over many decades as opposed to just a flash in the pan.
Yeah, and things will find their balance and it'll turn full circle without a shadow of a doubt. But once again, this is the Great Australian Reset, and there will be the Great Australian Regret without a shadow of a doubt. And you can call that whatever you want. FOMO, which we're starting to see, as we talked about last podcast. The should have, would have, could have community, which will definitely raise their appearance somewhere in the very near future, I believe. But before we get to that, let's quickly talk around the markets once again. So you mentioned that there's a lack of supply, right? We know that, and we said that would probably be the case because as the evidence of the market turning some really 2 months ago, as that started to appear, those that were contemplating selling said, well,
I'll hold off.
The market's turned. It's now rising market. I'll hold off so I won't put my property up for sale. Whether they needed to or whether it was they wanted to, and often the two can be different. But we're seeing that problem across the entire of Australia, really.
Yep.
Lack of stock on market. We've seen consumer confidence ebb upwards, which has put more people into the market. And if you wanted to use not the vacancy rates, but the clearance rates, the auction clearance rates, as a barometer to where the market sits, well, you'd say there's really starting to gain some momentum there. Now, we don't believe that the auction clearance rate should be the only thing you use as a barometer to the market. It's not the case at all, but it's I guess for a lot of people, and more importantly, and I say that quite deliberately, it is the media's barometer to the market.
Look, it's a good measure of sentiment, right, in
Correct.
terms of confidence in the market and the urgency that people see to get into the market. And generally, when confidence isn't there or the urgency isn't there, auction rates normally decline. But to get to a point where we are actually seeing clearance rates that we haven't seen for a little while, it shows how, first of all, there is less stock, right? So there is competition. But then it also shows people wanting to get in the market regardless of what the interest rates are, because they're looking at it from a spread point of view in terms of what they're paying for the money and what they're getting for the money. And if that's still sustainable, people will still jump in. I guess the qualifying factor here is at what level do they jump in? Were they able to afford a $2 million property and now they're down to 1.2? That is the determining factor.
It's a good point, because it happened during the GFC as well. Is that, I guess,
The compression factor.
The compression factor, and you can go back to one of the podcasts and I guess listen to how we explained that it's happening, or what it is, and it's definitely happening today. But it's not just happening in and amongst the value of properties; it's happening in the rental
the rent as well.
in the rental market as well. So, and we'll talk about that, because that is part of the great reset that we believe. But coming back to the different price brackets around the country, what we're starting to see is, and it's been gaining momentum, is that there's a very, very clear difference between each price bracket. The affordable corridors are extremely liquid.
Yep.
Now, what I mean by that is that there's good turnover.
It hasn't missed a beat.
Yeah, there's a volume of transactions, which is a sign of the liquidity within the market, I guess. There are certain brackets, price brackets around the country that are struggling. So the days on market are longer. They're not diabolical by any means, but they're certainly a lot longer than other parts of the market. And someone asked me the other day, well, why are we seeing, if there's such negative confidence within we'll classify it as the economy, but we're seeing, I guess, increasing confidence within the property side of things in terms of consumer confidence. Why are we seeing that when the cost of living is so is so tight? It's increased. And why are we seeing the auction clearance rates so buoyant? Part of the reason is people's finance are running out.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is they've had a pre-approval, they've been looking for the property, whatever it may be, their owner-occupied property, their investment property, whatever it is, but time is running out. And they know that if they don't activate or don't utilise that pre-approval, especially now that there's been another 0.25% increase, then their total capacity to borrow diminishes, and then they'll be out of the market again. So they're utilising that pre-approval before it expires, in combination with the fact that in some cases it's actually cheaper to own it than it is to rent it.
Yeah.
And so, and this is really important, or it's really evident perhaps in the more affordable corridors, where people are saying, well, once again, my mortgage, based on an interest-only payment or whatever the deposit may be, as an example, it's cheaper to own it than it is to rent. Mortgage repayments versus the rent, not all the other costs associated with ownership, because they're not taking that into account.
Yep.
They're just looking at the big ticket stuff, right? So if my mortgage repayments are going to be less or thereabouts of the mortgage repayments, and I'm a good saver, I have security in my job, there's a first home owner grant or a first home owner scheme, whichever way you want to sort of package it up, I may as well purchase, and they are. So what that's doing is it's taking another property out of the rental pool, putting more pressure on the vacancy rates, but it's also taking another saleable item, so stock on market, out of the equation with not enough infill, meaning stock coming back onto the market to balance it out. And that's the conundrum, I guess, where we are today. And even the banks, the economists, they're all surprised by the housing market turnaround.
Yeah, it's not predictable. It's not as predictable as it usually is.
No, it's not. And they're the first to admit that now. Or perhaps they're not admitting it, but they're very softly saying, well, we got that wrong again. We now expect the loss that we predicted of X not to be, and we see an increase of, whatever. They're all different.
Yeah. And if we look at, just a few short months ago, most economists were predicting a fairly strong slide in values. But then the factor of supply and demand comes in, and the values have stabilized, right? Most areas have not gone down in value. In fact, they're starting to creep back up again. Because, again, there isn't enough properties on the market. There are more buyers than sellers. The rental return is fairly high, and migration is at next level. So when you have all of these factors and the base element is missing, in other words, accommodation, you will have this increase. And therefore, the bureaucrats will try and solve this via legislation, right? So we're already starting to see the snippets of the pendulum tipping more towards renters than landlords. And again, that's a part of the market. And down the track, when we have an oversupply, which will happen in key areas, right? So it always happens. When we have that oversupply, the pendulum will swing back towards the landlords, whether it is through legislation or through pure commercial sense. And this is where a lot of people tend to shy away from investing, because they see that the rules of the game appear to be changing, whereas in fact it's not. It's actually the fundamentals that are being adhered to of supply and demand, of meeting the need to create a more even playing field as one side becomes more dominant. And once we understand that, that's where we can continue investing in any market, adjusting to those small changes in play, but not adjusting the end journey, not adjusting what we're trying to achieve, but certainly adjusting perhaps the asset selection, the area selection, the type of property, the type of end strategy for that property based on today's market, rather than saying, you know what, this worked for me 3 years ago, so I'll continue doing the same. It doesn't work that way.
There's a couple of good examples which just comes to mind, which I'll hold that thought until we get into the actual subject about the big reset. But I think in terms of the market conditions, we need to be very aware that, once again, and I said this earlier on, just like there's an affordability ceiling with what you can purchase, there is an affordability ceiling with rent as well. And I believe we're now at that point in some areas.
We're starting to see that now.
Yeah. So the escalation that we've had over the last, let's call it really 12 to 18 months is immense. And some would say that it's not fair and that it's over the top. But let's just keep in mind that we haven't really had rental growth over the last 10 years. We haven't kept pace with CPI inflation. And this has been a catch-up, and in some cases it's potentially overcooked.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, obviously, that's because of, in some cases, it's because of COVID, and that transient populace has moved to areas that didn't have quite as big a demand. But even in metropolitan areas, especially in the affordable corridors, right, it's become very aware very quickly that ceiling is now reached or close to it. Now, I'm being very general because every state, territory and region is quite different from the next. But I can think of probably 3 or 4 examples straight off the top of my head where, say, take parts of Brisbane, where that ceiling has now been reached. It's just not, they can't pay any, the tenant can't pay
There's
anymore.
no surplus cash anymore.
Yeah, there's no surplus. So it just hits it in terms of that ceiling. But even when you look into some of those areas, the houses have hit their ceiling, but the attached dwellings haven't.
Yep.
Because people are now saying, well, okay, well, I won't take the 3-bedroom house. I'll take the 3-bedroom townhouse as an example. I'll just have to make do. I won't have the yard for the cars and the caravans and the whatever it may be. But they're having to make sacrifices into what they can afford. So whilst the houses in some area have give or take hit that ceiling, the attached dwellings are still increasing.
Yeah.
That gap in terms of rental affordability is closing between the two types of dwellings. And that will be a repeat process or a repeat scenario, I believe, as time rolls on throughout most of the country. But you will also see rents go backwards.
Absolutely. And this is something we need to be very cognizant of, right? And I just want to backtrack a bit to explain affordability, right? Affordable corridor. And what we mean by that, it is affordable to that demographic.
Correct.
We're not talking about property prices. We're not talking about, buying a 200K house. We're talking about the affordable properties in that area that match the demographics, both from a rental point of view and from a price point of view. And each area has got a natural ceiling, right? So if the general income in household income is, let's say, 200,000 in that area, that's a ceiling, right? So in terms of how much that 200,000, along with your credit cards and your personal loans and your household expense, can buy you in terms of property or in terms of rent. Whereas if we went to another area where the traditional or the general household income is higher than that, then the affordability in that area goes higher, as does the rent. So this is something that we can't take a blanket approach to say, you've got to buy 200K houses. It's horses for courses, and understanding also the other side of the coin is the investor. And with the investor, what is their affordable corridor? Right. So what negative cash flow can they tolerate, or can they not tolerate any negative cash flow? And how much capital have they got to play with, which then determines where their affordable corridor lies. So we've got two things at play over here: affordable for the renter and the homeowner, and affordable corridor for the investor. And they don't necessarily are the same corridor.
I agree. I'd add a third into there. So affordability for the tenant, affordability for the investor, which is governed by
lending. I suppose.
They're lending, but it's not the intent purchase. It's just the cards they're dealt with, right?
Yep.
And then there's the affordability by the homeowner, because those that want, and they will make sacrifices to be able to purchase.
Yep.
Whether that be by government stimulus, grants, sacrifice, income, whatever it may be. And so they will go where they can afford, and they'll purchase where they can afford, just as the investor will, and just as the tenant does, as long as it's within, in the two bookend cases being the tenant and the homeowner, within their jobs hub, so to speak. The investor will purchase anywhere. The good investor should purchase anywhere and be borderless, as we all talk about. But that's going to be, for them, it'll be governed by those two components, being what the bank gives them and also what they can physically afford. And the good investor should know both.
And one of the podcasts, we talked about the bracket creep, right? So as an investor, you may start small, but you then creep up towards the bigger ticket items as part of a natural progression. Now, that may not be possible for every investor, because again, we have our own affordability ceiling. And this is something that a lot of people do get wrong, and they try and emulate what they've seen on social media of how someone's bought 10 properties or 20 properties, and they've got this property that's worth $2 million they bought, which was has a strong negative cash flow. But talking about that individual person, and what most people don't tend to really hone down on is how long that journey was. It's not overnight.
No, it's not. And once again, the bracket creep goes both ways. It doesn't necessarily mean increasing the price or what you're purchasing, but it can also go the other way.
Yep.
If the numbers stack, and part of the numbers stacking is what the banks say you can afford. And there's two types of affordabilities we've mentioned before. It's what the banks tell you can afford and what you really can afford.
Yeah.
And you need to know both.
Yeah, and you and me as investors who have seen many decades of investing in cycles, right? The hardest thing we have on our plate is understanding and coming to terms with an area where we used to pay 20 years ago 200,000, and now we're paying $1 million on the same area, the same type of house that we were buying 20 years ago. Now that is true investing, having to adjust to how the demographic and the affordability has happened in that year.
I'm smiling because it happened to me last week. I literally put an offer in on a property for $555,000 just because it sounded cool. And no, the number stacked up at $555,000. In the same suburb, I'd paid $127,000 for a long time ago, clearly. And it's just making sure that you can rationalise that between your head. Now, that $555,000 offer was in an area with a haircut and a shave, so paint and carpets as we refer to it, would have been a $650,000 property walk out the door in its worst case scenario. So it's hard as investors, even though we must take today's situation and environment and know that there's been growth, and we can't pair it or we can't rationalise it against what we paid for 5, 10, 15 years ago. Otherwise, you will never purchase another property.
Absolutely.
Ever.
And the other side of the coin, really, Steve, is that when we have a price decrease in an area, human nature and the general forces of nature is that when it does recover, it bounces back very quickly to its top price. And if the momentum is big enough, in other words, change in demographic, ease of finance, and a lot of people buying in there, it can break past that ceiling, right? So we need to be looking at it from both sides of the coin, right? As to how much we paid for it 20 years ago is irrelevant, and what the property was worth 2 years ago is also very irrelevant.
Correct. Yeah. It's just a psychological play, right? And this is part of the emotion or the emotions involved with investing. And we all know that there's a million pieces of narrative literature out there saying take the emotion out of investing.
It's very hard.
It is not possible. Now, whether that emotion is on that example that you gave, whether the emotion is on the dwelling type, the locality, they're the ones you shouldn't necessarily be having your bandwidth chewed up by. But the biggest emotional component, I believe, of which very few, and I mean very few, can eradicate is the emotional attachment to the debt.
Yeah.
Like that's the hardest part. And I would argue that the biggest challenge today for investors is rationalizing their relationship with debt. And we've talked about that before, but it's not as an important comment, I guess, when interest rates are 2.5%.
Yeah.
But when interest rates are 5 and 6 and 6.5 and 7%, that's when you see how strong your relationship with debt is and whether you truly understand it and what the cause and effect is. Because those that have a healthy relationship with their debt, they understand it. And as long as the banks are willing to give them money today, there's no stopping them from purchasing today, unless they believe the market is in a spiral, which I'd argue that 99% of people think that it's not, that really know their stuff. So that emotional connection with the debt is very, very important, and I believe that's the handbrake, that's the hurdle that is stopping a lot of people today. But let's talk, Vic, about this great Australian reset that you and I were only talking about over our bacon and eggs some half an hour ago. It's actually my bacon and eggs, and you were just stealing it.
Yeah, I bummed off you, mate. It's inflation's very high, so
it is. What did I pay for it? $13. I thought that was reasonable.
Very reasonable.
Compared to the smashed Avo I had a couple of years ago. Remember when it was the first time I had smashed Avo?
Yep.
Just didn't see what the...
In fact, it was one of our first recorded podcasts, the film podcast, where you had the smashed Avo, and
totally overrated.
Yeah.
Just saying. But anyway, this great Australian reset, and then what will follow will be the great Australian regret. It's here right now. The beginnings of it were back in 2016, 17. That's when the first stones were set. The foundations were laid. Clearly, from that moment on through to today, there's been so many contributing factors, both small and large, such as COVID, lockdowns, immigration, credit policy, and the like. But why this is the great Australian reset in my eyes is because there is probably 2 generations of people that have never seen this before.
Yep.
and at the very least there is one generation of people that have never seen rates this high in their life. And it's a real head game with them. And as a result of this head game, in a very dumbed down way to explain it, is that it's having a massive effect on the way that they're spending money, both in the good and the bad in some cases. But the effect is felt throughout the whole economy, and it's shifting demographics. It's shifting people's spending patterns. And then, of course, if we overlay that component that we've talked about probably a dozen times in the past, is technology.
Yeah.
And
that's a game changer.
It's a game changer, but it's part of the Great Australian Reset, because if you go back a couple of podcasts ago when we talked about the timing or the time distance between peaks and troughs and how that's changed over the last 15 years to reduce. It's all part of this puzzle of the Great Australian Reset. But just as importantly, this Great Australian Reset will have burnt a lot of people, and it's going to take a long time for them to get their confidence back, if they do.
Yeah.
That they might become that extreme conservative spender or person, investor, or whatever it may be. And there'll be people that I believe have educated themselves well enough to understand that this reset is actually a huge opportunity that we haven't seen, I believe, since... I'd go out on a limb and say that I've never seen it before.
No, we haven't seen all of these factors come in all together to create that platform of both advantage and regret in the market. And this is where, if you played your cards right, you would be the uncle or the brother-in-law at the barbecue in 10 years' time saying, I shouldn't have done it, you should not invest because you're going to lose money, or the other way around, saying, hey, get in because look at what I've achieved.
Do you know what? I have enough faith and confidence in people, hopefully in the majority, that will see this point in time as an opportunity. I truly do believe that most people think, you know what, we know what's around the corner, and I've said this before, that they're confident in the future. Like, let's just talk about this asset class. They're confident in what's around the corner. Just don't know when that corner begins.
And so let's talk about human behavior, right? The general human behavior is that they want to see some social proof before they start taking action, because it's too far out, it's too intangible. Even though we know that there'll be a very strong and sustained increase in values and rent within its ceilings across majority of the employment hubs in Australia, right?
It's a good point.
So we've got next level migration. We've got people that have got great choice in terms of how and where they work. And we've got increasing rent. And the spread between the money coming in and money going out isn't actually that great if you buy well. So when you have all of those things there, it's natural that we will see this sustained growth, provided the selection of the asset and the area is good, and you've looked at all of the fundamentals and taken away all of the fluff. So as we go through that, we know as investors that yes, we're going to get growth, but what's holding us back? It's actually the insecurity of, is it next year or the year after, or is it in 10 years' time, right? Arguably, it won't be in 10 years' time, right? But it just brings me back to, there was an analogy I used, Steve, if you recall, when we were doing these live in-person meetings in Parramatta, here in New South Wales, and in St Kilda in Melbourne, where we used to get well over 100 people that we just freely gave away information like we do right now. And one of the analogies I had used was the bamboo, right? The bamboo, the African bamboo and the Chinese bamboo, in the sense that if you plant the bamboo bulb and you come in and water it every single day, you have no growth. It does not even break soil. But after year 5, it just shoots up, and within weeks, it goes up meters and meters high, up to 27 feet, 2.7 meters, right? So it's competing against all of that. So this is where we need to understand and have the patience of watering the bamboo bulb to get that growth. Most of us try and latch onto these Facebook feeds where they're only talking about that growth spurt, not the fundamentals behind it. And the fundamentals doesn't necessarily mean buying property. It's getting yourself lend ready, getting yourself the ability to hold on to the property, getting your mindset in place rather than being drowned by all of these different strategies, different areas, different types of properties that are being floated around. If you stuck to the fundamentals, like we take our clients through, every single client through that journey, you can't go wrong, provided you stay focused on the goal. And this is where people go wrong, right? And this is where the great regret will come, where you waited too long for the social proof. You've waited too long to set yourself up. We've been saying in every podcast and every Facebook Live that get lend ready. Restructure your mortgages. Make sure that you look after your borrowing capacity. Look at your household
Keep
budget.
liquid.
Yeah, keep liquid. So they will be the ones that will regret down the track, as opposed to someone that's understanding that this is the reset. This is where the bulb is about to break soil, and let's put a little bit more water on it to allow it to grow a bit faster.
It's a really good point around the bamboo. It fascinates me that we spend 45 years in the workforce, and yet we're absolutely fixated and we get itchy feet on short-term investment strategies.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we'll spend 45 years in the workforce
Yep.
because we want that exit strategy or that exit out of the workforce as quick as we can, but nothing goes that quick all the time without elevated risk associated with it. This comes back to the reset point because there's a big segment of the market that are investors that have experienced rapid growth since COVID.
Yeah.
And think it's the norm.
And they're used to it.
Yeah.
It's
and
an
there's gonna be-
expectation.
correct. And so there'll be a reset. Now, they may be fortunate to experience that again in the next year, 18 months, 24 months. It may just happen. Yeah. And they'll experience another sort of escalated period of growth.
Validation.
But it's not the norm. It may not happen. So we need to make sure that we're looking at the medium and long term, which rolls into our design a decade theory and implementation, so that we can experience safely those moments of growth. But this reset is really because none of these pieces have come together before. Like, it's a crisis. Like, it really, really is.
It's never been this good.
What's never been this good?
The ability to invest.
Oh,
and,
so
and
yeah.
have the certainty of growth.
You're
right?
talking about. I thought you were talking about inflation in the economy. I was going, okay, it's wrong podcast. But we are in a situation where we've never seen it this way, both good and bad.
Yep.
From
because you can get hurt too.
absolutely,
Yep.
economy, inflation, assets, whatever the asset may be. But the reset is between our ears. It's because it's what we've experienced, what we've learnt, and what we don't know, right? Which is that fear component, I guess, for those that haven't experienced it or don't take the time to understand it. And there will people that will take a different direction because of what they're experiencing now and perhaps what they've experienced in the most recent 12 to 18 months.
Yep.
And think to themselves, this isn't for me. I'm just going to bury my head in the sand. I'm just going to do my thing. Yeah, I'll do me and I'll do my PAYG and I'll squirrel away and I'll invest in what they deem to be safely until the feeling, the thought process of what they've just experienced diminishes over time, and then they'll go again.
Yep.
Right? Now, that's a really important thing to understand because we carry the scars of our mistakes, whether they were our mistakes or the mistakes of others that then we were affected by, whether that be politicians, economies. You break that down into lending and, or maybe our own personal decisions. We carry those scars and either they scare you or they make you tougher. And I don't want to get too deep, but I'm just thinking about the mistakes that I've made over the years, the mistakes you've made over the years. You're only a fool if you do it again.
Yeah.
Right?
You learn from that and build up on it, right?
Correct. Or you think, how could I have done it better? And if I, just to get off topic a little bit, if I go back from when I first started investing, or even if I had gone back to when I first became self-employed, which was day one of leaving school, I can think of a million instances where I could have done it better.
Yeah.
And even if I bring it to investing, I can think of 1,000 instances where I could have done it better. There's also equally, I could have done it a lot worse, and I've been fortunate. But I would say my biggest regrets in and around investing in my scenario for me is that once I got over the stupidity of doing too much, right, because that was more of an ego thing in the early days.
So you got into the number of properties game.
Correct. Or I loved the transaction.
Yeah.
Not the result, right? So I just loved it, and I could. Money was free flowing. I'll buy. But we've talked about that before, and that hasn't happened again. Other than that, and because of that, the biggest regrets I've had is not doing more when I should have and when I could have.
Yeah.
And that's where I believe the great Australian regret will rear its ugly head. It'll start over the next 12 months.
Yeah.
And it will continue, and then people will jump in at the tail end of when they probably should have.
Gone harder, faster in the beginning.
And not just around property, just around
life. Yeah.
Continually. Because the spending habits of the last 3 years has unfortunately become very ingrained into the individual, and it's a bloody sharp, hard, rude shock for them now to change it 180 degrees.
It's very hard to adjust lifestyle.
Oh, without
very
fail.
hard, yeah. Now, one of the things you mentioned, Steve, was designing a decade. And for the listeners, if you have not already downloaded the ebook, we put together our thoughts on how the portfolio should progress. Go onto our website, and we'll also put a link in our show notes. Go to the website and download the book. It gives you a template of what we're trying to talk about, right? And what we're really saying right now is that don't wait for the rest of the crowd to jump in before you jump in. Jump in early, jump in smartly. So in other words, think of what you're trying to achieve, as opposed to getting caught up in, I want to buy a $2 million property, or I want to buy 200 properties. Fall in love with the result and reverse engineer it to what you've got right now, what cards you've been dealt with right now, to know what hand to play. And more importantly, know the game you're playing.
There'll also be a massive segment of the market that are going to be in a situation where they wish they were in a position to do something, because they understand.
And don't beat yourself up if you can't, right? You don't want to push the envelope too far.
No.
But also think outside the square in terms of affordability. What if you turned all of your loans into interest only? What if you got rid of a few subscription? What if you restructured your debt the way you had your expenditure, so that you're not changing lifestyle, but you're finding the means to hold on to the next property through your current expenditure?
Yeah, what if you stopped getting Uber Eats?
Every second day.
Yeah, what happens if you got rid of the subscriptions? What happens if you got rid of your credit cards?
Yeah.
What happened if you I mean, how bad do you want it?
That's right.
At the end of the day.
See, I sat down with a client, when was it, 3 days ago, 4 days ago. And one of the things we identified was that we could restructure all of our mortgages. He had 4 mortgages. We could restructure. 2 of them were principal and interest. The other 2, one of them was sitting at 8% interest rate. And by tapping into the growth that we had over the last couple of years, and by restructuring the debt, we were able to create about $700 worth of holding cost per week for the next property, plus free up the capital, capital to actually purchase the next one. And so now, if you look at it from his viewpoint, right, nothing's changed. Yet he's got another property in the portfolio. It's as simple as that, understanding which parts you need to tweak to get a better result.
And sometimes, to be fair, there's nothing you can do.
Yep,
So
absolutely.
it's just a matter of forced consolidation, which is sometimes when you make the most money.
Yes.
Because you're not feeling FOMO. It just is what it is, so to speak. But coming back to the reset, Vic, we've talked about, from the consumer level, the factors that are going to change people's lives moving forward and the way they think about stuff. But the other part of the Greater Australian Reset, and I have a feeling about this, is that, remember the pink bats? The pink bat scheme from Kevin 07?
Yep.
Those of you that are too young to remember that, which is really sad, Google it. I have a feeling that part of our great reset is going to be activated by government policy. And therefore the governments.
Some will be
of the
good,
time.
some will be atrocious.
Correct. And the reason I say the pink bat scheme is because it's not a knee-jerk reaction because they've identified the lack of accommodation, right? But they're not going to think it through from, I guess, idea stage
To implementation.
So conception to implementation. I don't think they're going to think it through well enough. Part of that will be knee-jerk reactions on, let's just get it done. Let's not worry about the implications moving forward. And what I'm really referring to is the build to rent.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be so many rorts within that.
That's a social housing experiment that's going to go wrong.
I think it'll have a short-term benefit. But there'll also be instances where it's too little too late.
Yeah.
Or too much too late, if that makes sense. It'll tip it into some areas oversupply, but it'll also, as we've mentioned before, I don't think the social impacts are going to be, I don't think they've been well thought through, so to speak. But from an economic point of view or from a process point of view, there's going to be so many rorts in that build to rent space. But it, in combination with government stimulus, like we've seen the extension of the first homeowner scheme and a tweak to it, which is massive. We'll talk about that perhaps in another podcast. In fact, what that does is it comes back. Remember the podcast we did a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, saying there's only three things we need. We need consumer confidence, we need the ability to get credit, and we're going to need government intervention.
Yep. Intervention is happening.
And we only need two of them.
Yep.
The intervention and the confidence is rising. So we've got two out of the three.
Yeah.
It's there. And the government will continue to put in pieces to play of these intervention, we'll call it, via different stimulus package, whether it be another construction grant. We've already seen the stamp duty reform. Will that be rolled out across the country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? That is going to be part of the big reset.
Yeah.
Huge part of the reset.
So the reset, we've talked about the property, but then the governing side of it, the legislation, right? So and we're already starting to see it, as you said, from that viewpoint, government intervention. But the legislation that that tend to keep people away from the market. This is the legislation where we're leaning more towards the tenants. Understand that it could either be here to stay or it could be short term as the momentum tips back to the landlords. The tenants, in the sense that there is an oversupply in the market, which will happen. We don't know whether we definitely know it won't be in the next 3 years. Right?
True.
Yeah. So when we have this legislation, it should not make you stop investing. All it needs is your awareness in terms of this legislation and how it impacts your cash flow and how it impacts your ability to increase rent. The reality of it is that we are on a trajectory where there will be containment of how quickly and how much we can increase our rent, because more and more of the population will rent. And so it's a natural flow on that they will try and control that.
That's an interesting point, because we know what happened, what the Queensland state government tried to do in versions 1 and version 2, and then they, I guess, did something just to make themselves not look like total fools. But I do believe that will be a common occurrence throughout different states. I see that WA is starting to talk about rent freezes now as well, right? So whilst that will be a deterrent for investors to get into the market, the consequence of that will be a better time for investors that are already in the market, because it'll just mean less supply, increased demand, and we know what the result of that is. So we need to be aware of investors. There'll be these short-term fluctuations in and around policy that may or may not
stay there forever.
Yeah, and that may or may not be beneficial to you. Yeah. Like, as we've said before, if you don't play the game will play you. So choose which part of the equation you want to be a part of. But the reset is here.
Yeah.
It's already started, and I'm not being some wild conspiracist at all. It's just a fact of life. It's not good. It's not bad. It's It's just something that is happening. Economies change over time. Policy changes over time, and it will always continue to do so. It's just that we are in this moment of flux where we've never seen all these different pieces come together at the one time, and there is only one way to get ourselves out of it. Only one, and that's give us more supply. And who do you think's going to supply it, and how do we supply it? There's the answer to the problem.
Yeah, and in a market that's changing like this, it is prudent to throw away fear. However, it is equally as prudent to be cautious. There's a big difference between the two.
Oh, absolutely, and that'll play into part of the Great Australian Regret. Yeah, there is a definite segment of the community out there that are in a position to do something, but they're not.
Yeah.
Right now,
hence they're fearful.
Procrastination. I'll just wait and see, whatever it may be. And then there is a big part of the community or the public that would, given the chance, be doing something today. They just can't.
They just can't. Yep.
And look out when they can. Is the bottom line. So going back to your whole fear or commentary around fear, there's a definite part of the market that it's experiencing that at the moment. But as we start to see these better news reports through the media about, property prices have increased, or the banks' forecasts are now flipped on their head from a negative to a positive growth segment, that will be enough to change those people's minds when it should really be nothing to do with it.
Yep.
But it is what it is. I mean, that's for the uneducated in its most simplistic form. They will follow what the general market and what the masses are doing, as opposed to the people that are ahead of the curve. And that's why it's going to be a reset, and this will go down in combination with COVID, because that's part of the reason this will go down in history. I mean, you think about it, we're already starting to see these parts of the market in the smaller regional areas that are having a reversal. Because people are saying, well, geez, I need to earn more dollars. Maybe there's not enough to do in here for the family. Can't grow my own chickens anymore and have my own veggies.
And this is where we were saying is that when you're evaluating investment, take the COVID filter off.
You have to. I mean, look, to be fair though, there's some parts of COVID which will be here forever in terms of a consequence of it, or maybe not forever, but for a hell of a long time it'll outlive you and I. So we need to be aware of that. But I think the knee-jerk reaction to, I guess, moments in time, and therefore changing your investment strategy from what I believe to be fundamentally correct to more of a speculative approach, well, then you're not an investor, you're a trader. And there's a very big difference. So you need to identify who you are. And actually, I think we did some time ago, we did a podcast in and around what type of investor are you. So go back and listen to that. So it's here, Vic, the reset. It's on its way.
Yep, and it's up to you whether to take advantage of it, if you can, or live in fear and therefore not take advantage. But we would strongly advocate a cautious approach. And to be able to do that, you need to know where you stand. You need to know what your operating costs are, where your portfolio, if you've already got one, sits in terms of cash flow and lending potential. And if you wanted to get guidance in terms of being able to work out a workable plan in today's market, then all you need to do is reach out to us. You do get to sit down with myself and Steve. And there's, of course, a bit of a process to make sure that when you do sit down with us, you get the best out of our time. So first of all, you do talk to Melissa, who's a accomplished investor, and she gets you ready to be able to ask the right questions when you sit down in front of us so that we can guide you better.
And if you want to listen to this podcast, obviously you would be. That was a pretty silly thing to say. So it's on the Apple iTunes, it's on Spotify and the like. But if you wanted to watch every second episode, it's on our YouTube channel, Vic, which you can, I don't know, see our...
Subscribe, yeah. So just
subscribe.
Press the bell icon.
Is that it?
Yep, that's it.
What you do?
Yeah,
Press
that's
the
what
bell.
you do. Yeah.
It does that wear on the video now that someone highlights?
Yeah. That's the one. Yeah. We don't do cheesy stuff like that.
We would if we could, if we knew how to.
Yeah.
But look, and if you do like these podcasts, please give us a review. It means a lot to everybody involved. It's not just Vic and I doing this. there is a team behind us, so they would love the feedback, whether it's good, bad, or ugly. We appreciate it all. But until next time, Vic, which will be the next podcast will be with
Phil,
with Phil Tarrant from Momentum Media and Smart Property Investment Magazine, and of course our Facebook Lives every second Thursday. They're up on our website if you've missed any of them to go back through, but it's all there at your disposal. So until next time, Vic.
See you then.
We'll see you then.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature, does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs, and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you.
Stay.